The idea that if you'll come out of the world, I'm going to bless you even greater. And we see Abraham with the trust and the faith to do that. Second of all, we see the idea that Abraham's descendants are going to be blessed through this. It's not just going to be for you. And obviously, we'll talk about that a little bit more today, that you need to trust that after you're gone, there's going to be blessings that are going to continue because of this covenant relationship that you have accepted today. We see thirdly that those that are in a relationship with Abraham are going to be blessed. Not just Abraham himself, not even just his children, but the idea that the servants in his house were blessed. We're going to see the nations around Abraham are even blessed because of who Abraham is when they are in a good relationship. You know, the idea of I will bless those who bless you, I will curse those who curse you. And we'll see an example of that even again today as we talk about it. And finally, ultimately, the idea that we will be blessed, the entire world, that in your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And Paul spends a lot of time, obviously, explaining that once we get into the new covenant, as we see it fulfilled not only in Isaac and in Jacob and the people beyond that, but ultimately in Christ, as we see him coming into the world. But when we think about all of these things, there's a central event that takes place that if this doesn't happen, none of these other things work, and that is this idea of the child. The idea that the child has to be born, has to come into this world, and has to come into the world in such a way as to inspire a faith in God that was not there before. If you remember, God is essentially starting, as we talked about in week 1 of this, God is starting from scratch with Abraham. Abraham is a man living in an idolatrous world, among an idolatrous family, and God comes to him maybe for the first time. We don't know what Abraham's knowledge of God was. All we know is that God comes to him and says, I'm going to show you who I am, and if you're willing to put your faith in me, I'm going to bless you beyond what you can imagine. And Abraham leaves that world behind. He trusts him. He puts his faith in him. So all of this ultimately happens when we see that Isaac is born. And so when we talk about the child of promise, and we'll read a little bit in Genesis if you want to go over to Genesis 17. A couple of these things we've read before, but I want to read them in the light of specifically the birth of Isaac and the significance of what's about to happen. In Genesis chapter 17, verses 15 through 21, if you'll read with me I'm reading from the ESV, it says, And God said to Abraham, As for Sarah, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of people shall come from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, Oh, that Ishmael might live before you. And God said, No, but Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year. And it's useful, we kind of alluded to this. I don't know how clearly we made this point, but it's useful that the covenant of circumcision, as we talked about, has just been ratified. And we talked about the idea that circumcision in a lot of ways had more to do with the parent than it had to do with the child. It was an act that a parent did out of faith for God and faith in the promise and a commitment to pass that commitment on down to the children in a way that was permanent in nature, in a way that frankly would cause pain and discomfort, a way that involved bloodshed. And that's, again, a lesson for another day. But the idea that it was a reflection of a commitment to that covenant, and it's at that point, right after that, I don't think that's coincidental, that God then tells him exactly how he is going to fulfill that promise of the child. Because you've committed to raising that child in a covenant relationship with God. And he says, and oh, by the way, this is the new one. This is the new message, by the way, that it's not going to happen through your handmaiden. It's not going to happen through any other means. It is going to be your son, and it's going to happen through Sarah, your wife. And sometimes when we think about Abraham laughing, well, why is he laughing? Doesn't he know this? Well, again, this is really the first time that God has clarified and said, this is how it's going to happen. I think sometimes we give Abraham, we somehow point to Hagar and Ishmael as a failing of Abraham's faith that he's going to help God out. But the truth of the matter is God hadn't told him who the mother was going to be yet. So he simply makes an assumption. Well, I know that my wife is barren. She's been barren, as we read in chapter 11, since their marriage. They know that she's not going to have any kids. Therefore, God must mean through my handmaid. And you're going to see, by the way, this is a trend with Abraham. Abraham's faith will always be the thing that drives his inferences, his conclusions that he says, because God has promised this, then that must mean this. And I'm going to act accordingly. So if we go on, as we see that this covenant is ratified, this promise is given, and Abraham, despite his initial misgivings and his initial reaction, I can imagine if any one of you who is beyond childbearing age, someone came to you and gave you this news, the first thing you're going to do is probably laugh. But when you that's the initial reaction. But after you get past that, oh, wait, this is God telling me this. And then the faith takes over. And we see in Genesis 18:1, we talked about that idea of a covenant last week. In chapter 1, we see Abraham being visited by God, and the context seems to indicate that this happened immediately after that, after he had circumcised Ishmael, because Sarah's reaction is one of shock as well. Abraham, for whatever reason, has not told her yet this part of the news. And so we see her reacting to that in verse 11 through 14 of chapter 18. It says, now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, am I worn out, and my Lord is old? Shall I have pleasure? The Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son. And we see this fulfilled over in chapter 21. The idea that God at this point is going to turn Sarah's laughter into joy. I think that's an amazing statement when you think about it, when you kind of internalize what's being said. It says in verse 1 of chapter 21, the Lord visited Sarah as he said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 years old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would have nursed children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. And that's an amazing thing when you think about it. And this is one of the great illustrations of the grace of God, that, when we think about going to somebody and promising something, that I'm going to do something, and their response is to laugh at me. Our response a lot of times, if I do that, is to go back and say, see, I told you. You didn't believe, but I knew. And the idea of kind of turning it around and almost kind of putting in your face, the image that we see here in the scriptures, that God has turned that laughter that was at once a sign of a lack of faith, and has turned it into joy. The idea that God can take our faithlessness, and turn it into something that comes back to us and increases our faith and increases our devotion to God. That's an amazing side story that comes out of this. And I think it's important, too, to remember about this joy and to truly appreciate what's going on, because I don't know that we can fully appreciate what Sarah is responding to here, even though I know that all of us, who have known women who cannot have children and who have struggled with that, we understand what that does to them emotionally. And we understand what that news would mean to them, knowing that they could, all these times when they couldn't have a child, and all of a sudden they find out that they're expecting. And we see the joy that takes place as a result of that. But when we think about what's going on in the biblical history of what it meant to have children, I think we can see that this is an even greater promise that is fulfilled to Abraham and Sarah, and the benefits. And this goes back to the very beginning. It's one of the great themes in the book of Genesis, in fact. We alluded to this last week, that God is introduced in Genesis 17 as God Almighty for the first time, the term El Shaddai. And it is used in the book of Genesis almost exclusively to refer to a context of fruitfulness. Not only in terms of wealth, but in terms more specifically of the fruitfulness of bearing children. And the meaningful nature of this, and even beginning in Genesis 4:1, when the first child is born, at least the first one that we read about, the first son, when Eve gives birth to Cain, and she says, I have gotten a man-child with the help of the Lord. From the very beginning, there is this understanding and knowledge that childbirth comes from God, that it is a gift from God, and it is done for our blessings. And we see it's a theme that repeats itself throughout the Bible. That is, for example, in 1 Samuel, we see the story of Hannah coming to the tabernacle and praying desperately for a child because she has been barren, and seeing the results and the grace in the way in which she views such a valuable gift of this child. And even in 2 Kings 4, when we see Elisha going to this woman who has put him up and has been hospitable, and he asks his servant, what can I do for this woman? What can we do for her? And the greatest gift that they could come up with was the idea that she doesn't have a child. I want her to have a child. And that's something that, again, sometimes we as parents have to remind themselves of this. But because some days it's probably not as apparent as others, but the idea of children as being a gift from God that is to be treasured. And it's a sign, especially in the time that we're talking about, getting ahead of myself. It's important for us to remember as well that not only do we value children, but God values children. This is a gift that God looks at and says, I really don't have a lot that I can give you that's more valuable than this. And we see how God views children. In fact, as we've talked about the evil that surrounded these people in the land of Canaan at the time of Abraham, and again later on when Israel is going to come back in, if you remember over in the book of Leviticus chapter 20, verse 1 through 5, we read the encouragement and the admonition of when Israel was going to come into this land and what they had to be careful about. In Leviticus 20, it says, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, say to the people of Israel, any one of the people of Israel, or of the strangers who sojourn in Israel, who gives any of his children to Molech, shall surely be put to death. The people of the land shall stone him with stones. I myself will set my face against that man and will cut him off from among his people, because he has given one of his children to Molech, to make my sanctuary unclean and to profane my holy name. And the idea of the severity of this, and obviously there's an idea that this is profaning the Lord's temple, is worshiping idols, but there's a language that is used, in fact, in Ezekiel 16, when Ezekiel talks about this, that the children of Israel had gone into this. He doesn't refer to them as your children anymore. Now he refers to them as my children. The children that I have given you, these are my children, and you are offering them to another god. The horrible nature of how God viewed this topic. And of course, we see in Jesus manifesting that himself in Matthew 19 later on, when he says, don't allow the children to come to me, for as such as are the kingdom of heaven. God sees children as innocents, as pure, as those who are a model of what his citizens in the kingdom of heaven need to be. And God places that kind of value on children. And even more so, even beyond that, this is a sign, or it would have been seen at that time, of a confirmation of divine favor. This is it's a sign that God is looking upon me with favor, because as we kind of alluded to in Genesis 4, if God helped us to have children, then it also must mean that God has a hand in us not having children. And the assumption in that time, and even sometimes even today maybe, is the idea that it is God who opens and closes the womb. It is God who is responsible for you having children or not having children. And we see passages in Genesis 20 and Genesis 30, and even in the idea that there is an attribution that if I'm not having children, it's because God has closed the womb. And that may very well be a sign of punishment, of God's displeasure before us. And it was assumed that way. And I think even in 2 Samuel 6, you remember the story of Michal, when she derides David. The author writes after that from that day forward that she was barren. She had no children. It's almost as if the author is using that as a badge to say, this is why she didn't find favor in the eyes of her husband, and by extension, she didn't find favor in the eyes of God because of her attitude. There's that premise that a sign of a child given is a sign that God is blessing you and that God is in favor. And surely we see that in the case of Abraham. And we see, as a result of all of this, that Abraham and Sarah are going to be convicted of the promises and the power of God, and they're convicted in two ways. First of all, that God can bring something from nothing. God can provide the seed where the seed is non-existent. He will raise up a child for you through his power where there was nothing before. And thirdly, and second of all, that God can bring life from lifelessness. The idea of man, as Hebrews 11:12 describes Abraham as being a man who was as good as dead. at the age of 100. I know that if I would hope that when we get to that age, that Lord willing, I make it to 100, somebody is not going to refer to me as good as dead. But we understand the concept, right? The idea that God can take someone who has no more, his life is about to go, and can extend that through his own power. And in Romans 4, I think we alluded to this in the past, but going back to look at it again, in Romans 4:16 through 21, Paul talks about the idea of Abraham being the father of us all, as it is written, I have made you the father of many nations, in the presence of the God in whom he believed, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. In hope he believed against hope that he should become the father of many nations. As he had been told, so shall your offsprings be. He did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb. No unbelief made him waver concerning the promise of God, but he grew strong in his faith as he gave glory to God, fully convinced that God was able to do all that he promised. And when we think about Isaac, and when we think about what he represented and what he meant to Abraham and also to us, there's that idea that he was the example. He was the proof to Abraham, wasn't he? Because don't you think that Abraham, every day as he wakes up and he looks out and he sees Isaac playing in the field, or Isaac doing his chores, or whatever it is that he had him to do, he looks at Isaac and he's reminded that that was the fulfillment of God's promise right there. And if God can do that for me, then he could do these other things too. And that maybe if God has promised to me that my people, that my children, my ancestors are going to come back and possess this land, then I know that he can do it. And I'm going to trust that God will bless me even after I'm gone. This covenant doesn't have to end. It is, in fact, an eternal covenant. And there's a line that I think gets lost a little bit. We just kind of gloss it over a little bit, but I think it is a very significant verse. Because in chapter 25, verse 11, it says that after the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac. And very similar to what we read about with Abraham, we don't really know anything, or we're not told specifically about the character of Isaac. The writer doesn't really make a lot of efforts to explain to us how good Isaac was. And Isaac walked with God, and Isaac had great faith. And in praising Isaac, he simply says, as emphasis, because Abraham had a covenant relationship with God, God extended that covenant to his son, and he blessed Isaac. And of course, Paul will explain this, and I'm not going to go into it a lot because I know that we're kind of familiar with the concepts that Paul will bring out over in Romans 9 and Galatians 4, where he talks about Isaac being the child of promise as opposed to the child of the flesh. The idea that Ishmael was representative, and this must have really galled the Jews who read about this, that Ishmael, the one who was cast out, the child who was not of Sarah, the child who would not be in the seed line of Jacob, he would not be part of the kingdom of Israel. Paul says, no, that actually represents Israel. Isaac is the child of promise. He represents those who serve not because they have inherited something, but because they have trusted in God, as Abraham has trusted in God. The idea that he is the example of what God's covenant looks like in the flesh in a lot of ways. He is the affirmation of all that God has promised, and that if we will trust in God, we know that we have that same promise today. We have that same opportunity to be blessed and to be a part of that covenant relationship. And I originally I was going to spend a lot of time talking about that. But as I started preparing this, I kind of decided to go in a little bit of a different direction, because I started thinking about Isaac. And I kind of alluded to this earlier. But when we think about who Isaac was, how many lessons, when was the last time we had a lesson about Isaac? Not talking about any of the things that we talked about here. Isaac is a man of faith. Isaac is one of the fathers of our faith. Isaac is an example for us. And I'm not sure I've ever heard one. But I think there's a reason for that. Because when we think about Isaac, the man, we don't really know a lot about Isaac. At least nothing like Abraham. I mean, we can talk about Abraham from Genesis 12 all the way down through, Genesis chapter 25. It's like 13, 14 chapters devoted primarily to Abraham. And then we get to Isaac. And what does Isaac do? Well, Isaac, in a lot of ways, isn't he kind of the bridge? Well, we see Isaac referred to in the Bible, if you go and look at how many times Isaac is referred to separate, outside the context of I am the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, it doesn't happen very often. There's a couple of passages. Amos actually singles Isaac out as a symbol for Jerusalem, for Judah, for the kingdom. But for the most part, it is always I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And sometimes doesn't it feel like Isaac is kind of put in there just to be polite? Because, all right, Abraham is the father of our faith. He is mentioned over and over again. We talk about him. He is the inspiration. He's the one to which we are modeled, Jew and Gentile alike. And then we got Jacob, who literally is Israel. He's God's people. He is the representation. He is the one where God finally says that this is going to be my chosen people and everybody else is not. And then we got Isaac. And Isaac's value seems primarily to be the fact that he got us from Abraham to Israel. And in fact, as I mentioned, the thing that we're not going to talk about today, we'll talk about, Lord willing, next week, is the idea that Isaac is most favorable for all the things that are done to him, not the things that he does. He is the fulfillment of the covenant, as we said. He is the one which Abraham is commanded to take up onto the altar in Mount Moriah and offer as a sacrifice. Isaac, in a lot of ways, is a very passive character in the Bible. It's not about the things that he does. It's about the things that are done to him, or more to the point, done for him. Because the thing about the life of Isaac, if you were someone who was envious or someone who looked around, if you were Ishmael, for example, looking at Isaac and thinking, this guy hadn't had to do anything. He has been handed everything in his life. He has been given this inheritance. He's got this wealth that he never did anything for. When he needed a wife, his father went and got one for him. There's nothing that he has to do. He's just blessed. He's blessed because God chose to bless him because of his father Abraham. You ever met anybody that got by just because of who they were related to? That's the image that we almost see of Isaac, right? If we look at the chapters in the Bible on a superficial level, I think that's kind of the picture that we get of him. He's just kind of there. He's known as the one that was sacrificed. He's known as the one that was duped by his son Jacob. He's just the guy that things happen to. But what we see, I think, the writer gives us some clues, and we're not going to dig too deeply into this, but I think it's worthwhile thinking about Isaac not as someone who is passive, someone who is just a kind of a pawn in the story, but as a real person. And as a real person, more to the point that who was godly, who was a man that Abraham raised as a godly man in an ungodly world. And you remember that we talked about the idea that Abraham was committed to raising Isaac in a covenant relationship with God. And we see it over in Genesis 24 when he tells his servant, we talked about going to get Isaac a wife. And he says, put your hand under my thigh that I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven, the God of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell, but will go to my country and to my kindred and take a wife for my son Isaac. I thought about this a little bit. What do you think? Those of you who are, I know we've got at least one parent here who's got one kid that's not quite marriageable age, but getting there. And we got some that are going to be there in a few years. And just imagine if you're thinking in your mind, look, taking your child aside and say, look, whatever you do not marry somebody from Alabama. These people are horrible. They will ruin your life. You need to go to whatever state. I was tempted to insert one particular state. I'm not going to do it. You can fill in whatever state you choose. Imagine the culture that must have inspired that. We think that our culture is rotten. Just the idea that there is nobody redeeming here. There's nobody that's going to make your life better. There's nobody that I trust to maintain that covenant relationship with God. You need to go someplace else. That's the environment that Isaac was raised, and Abraham did it. And Isaac maintained it. And there's something to be said for that. Because we think about our lives today and how are we going to raise kids in an environment like this? It can be done. Abraham and Isaac are an example of that. But as we look at Isaac's character, we start to see that this isn't just a passive thing. This isn't just something that Abraham did and Isaac just kind of did it because. We see Isaac's own faith explained. And again, these are things that I think we have to make some inferences about because the Bible doesn't really go to a lot of detail to clarify and to give us examples of this. But I think it's safe to say that Isaac was first and foremost a man of prayer. Because the first thing that we see, the first image we see of Isaac as a grown-up is the servant is bringing Rebekah to him, and she sees him, and he has gone out into the field to meditate. And the assumption there is, we're not told what he was thinking about. But pretty much any time we see the concept of meditation in the Old Testament or in the Bible at all, you're meditating about God. You're thinking about God's nature, about God's law. You may even be praying. The idea that Isaac appears to be a very thoughtful man who spent time thinking about God. And we see the example over in Genesis 25. Again, another one that we kind of gloss over a little bit. The idea that when Rebekah was barren, what happened? Isaac prayed to God, and God heard him and gave him a child, or gave him two children. Abraham didn't. We don't know if Abraham ever prayed for Sarah or not. We're not told that he did, but Isaac did. And don't you think maybe that's clearly a sign of his faith, but it's also a sign that Isaac's looking at himself and says, God made me. God brought me when there was no hope. Surely God can do for Rebekah what he has done for my mother. He depended on God. He prayed to God, and he prayed with faith. We see as well that Isaac was a man of peace. Isaac was not someone, Abraham was essentially a warlord, probably for a lot of his life. And, his answer, and this is not a condemnation, but it kind of reminds me, I'm going to mention this earlier, it's the contrast of David and Solomon all over again. Abraham was a man of blood. When Lot and his family got kidnapped, Abraham rounded up the horses and got the swords out and said, let's go. But what does Isaac do? When Isaac is involved in conflict in the land of Canaan, we see examples of this over in Genesis 26, verse 17, the conflict of the wells. And again, we don't necessarily appreciate the severity of this situation because we have tap water. But when we think about the idea that we're going around digging for a place that will give us life, what does it mean when I get that and somebody wants to take it away from me? I would imagine that in our culture today, we'd be out there sitting out with our AK-47s and our shotguns and saying, come take it. But that's not who Isaac was. Isaac in Genesis 26, 17 through 22, it says, so Isaac departed from there and encamped in the valley of Gerar and settled there. And Isaac dug again the wells of water that had been dug in the days of Abraham his father, which the Philistines had stopped after the death of Abraham. And he gave them names that his father had given him. But when Isaac's servants dug in the valley and found there a well of spring water, the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen, saying, the water is ours. So he called the name of the well Esek, because they contended with him. Then they dug another well, and they quarreled over that also. So he called its name Sitnah. And he moved from there and dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it. So he called its name Rehoboth, saying, for now the Lord has made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land. Again, that idea that Isaac understood that God had given us this sustenance. He has given us this well. He has given us this water, and he has given us peace. And he glorified God from that. And it's interesting, too, that later on in Genesis 26, we're going to see that we're talking about the first conflict between Israel and the Philistines, essentially. And we're going to see Abimelech. This is not the same Abimelech that was dealing with Abraham. He would have been very old. Abimelech most likely is a title that was given to the king of the Philistines at that time. And we see Abimelech coming to Isaac and saying, I want to make a treaty with you because it's very clear that God is blessing you. There's some irony and maybe some foreshadowing as well. That here is going to be Israel's greatest enemy, Israel's thorn in the side, the nation that more than any else is going to be shown as the bane of their existence. So much so that when the Romans rename this area as a slight to the Jews, they think, well, who can we name this after that will absolutely gall them to the core? And the answer was the Philistines. And so we're going to name it Palestine. And yet this man had a covenant with Isaac because Isaac was a man of peace. And Isaac sought peace, and he achieved it because God was with him. We see a man, Genesis 24:67, again, another throwaway passage, but gives us some insight into Isaac's character, the idea that Isaac honored his parents, and particularly his mother in chapter 6 and chapter 24, which is describing him taking his wife, Rebekah. And it says at the very end, so Isaac was comforted at the loss of his mother. This was 3 years later. This was a man who was mourning the death of his mother 3 years beyond. And for those who have lost parents, I suspect that you can relate to this. I'm blessed that I still have both my parents. I suspect that 3 years after I lose them, I'll still be mourning that because they mean that much to me. And we see Isaac having this care and this concern for his parents. And what's, again, lost in the idea that we talked about Abraham going to get Isaac a wife. Well, Isaac didn't have to wait for a wife. He could have gone. He was 40 years old at this point. He could have gone and got his own wife. And in fact, we contrast that with his own son Esau, because what does Esau do? Not only does he do it once, but he does it twice, and he does it purely out of spite. Because I see that they blessed my other brother Jacob. You know what? The worst thing I could do for them is to go marry a Canaan, or marry a Hittite, or marry a Canaanite, marry somebody that's going to gall them. Isaac does not do that. Isaac respects and honors his parents. And we see a man, I think, as well, that we can allude truly loved his wife in a way that was evident to those around about him. And again, this is an interesting comparison, because Abraham, we know, had Sarah. He also had a handmaiden, and we're going to read later on that he had a number of concubines. We only read about one woman in Isaac's life, and that was Rebekah. And we see that he loved her. He treated her with kindness. And there's, again, one of those throwaway lines that you have to read between the lines a little bit, I think, when you think about Isaac's character. But when we see in chapter 26, when Isaac has gone and taken his family over into this other area to ride out the famine, as it were, it says in verse 7, when the men of the place asked him about his wife, he said, "She is my sister," for he feared to say my wife, thinking lest the men of the place should kill me because of Rebekah. Again, same problem that Abraham had. But notice what it says. When he had been there a long time, Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, looked out of the window and saw Isaac laughing with Rebekah, his wife. And so Abimelech called Isaac and said, "Behold, she is your wife. How then could you say she is my sister?" And that's kind of an interesting thing, because, I laugh with my sister all the time. But there's clearly something about how Isaac related to Rebekah that made it very clear that he loved her, that she was his wife. The idea that he did not hide his devotion to her, he did not hide his affection for her. And I think that comes very clearly through in his story. And the fact that he did only have the one wife. We don't read of any other women in his life, because he clearly was devoted to his wife. I don't think that's reading too much into the text to make that assumption. We see Isaac as a man, above all, who loved and trusted God in a way maybe even that his father Abraham didn't. Now, again, in all fairness, Abraham had to be shown some things that he'd never seen before. Isaac has lived it. Isaac is living the fulfillment of God's promises to him. But when we see over in Genesis chapter 28, we see Isaac confronted with a situation not unlike what his father Abraham had come up against at some point. Excuse me, hold on a second. This is not the one I want to look at. It's 26, let's see. Yeah, chapter 26, verse 1, excuse me. It says, "Now there was a famine in the land beside the former famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Gerar, to Abimelech, king of the Philistines," as we've already read. "And the Lord appeared to him and said, 'Do not go down to Egypt. Dwell in the land which I shall tell you. Sojourn in the land, and I will be with you, and I will bless you. For to you and to your offsprings I will give these all these lands, and I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham your father. I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and will give to your offspring all these lands. And in your offsprings all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws.'" And it says in verse 6, "So Isaac settled in Gerar." He didn't go to Egypt, which is what Abraham did. And again, now, did God appear to Abraham and say, "Don't go to Egypt"? We're not told, and I suspect that he did not. But when God told him, "You trust me, I will take care of you. Egypt is calling you. Egypt has riches. Egypt has food. Egypt has all these things, but don't go down there. Go here." Kind of along the lines of what he tells Abraham. "Abraham, come out of this country and settle here, and I'll bless you." And Isaac listens to him and does what he has asked him to do. We see later on in that chapter, down in chapter 22, we already talked about the idea of the well. He moved when he dug the well, they had water, and as they find water, he says, "For the Lord has made room for us. We shall be fruitful in the land." God, he saw these blessings as coming from God, and he believed it so much that he continues and passes that even on to his own son, doesn't he? Because when Jacob is ready to have a wife later on, he does the exact same thing that Abraham did. He's so committed to God that he is going to pass that faith on to his son. He says, don't get married to somebody here. Go back to our kinspeople, find a wife there. And he sends Jacob off, obviously, to live in the house of Laban. So, why don't we hear more about Isaac? There's a lot of great things that we can say about Isaac. But in a lot of ways, as a storyteller, as a former journalist, I can say that I think that the reason we don't hear more about Isaac, and there's only about one chapter really referring to Isaac, is that Isaac's life was kind of boring. Just not a lot happened to Isaac. You compare it to Abraham. He's called out into a new country. He goes down into Egypt. He gets conflicting with the Pharaohs. He comes back. He has to have a rescue party for Lot. He has this covenant relationship with God. God is coming down and making these new promises. We see him involved in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. We see all these things that Abraham is involved in. Isaac's life is pretty tame by comparison. And then we get to Jacob, whose whole life was strife and contention. And difficulties. When Jacob comes to Pharaoh and describes his life, he describes it as my days have been few and evil, and I have not attained to the days of my father. Jacob lived a hard life. Isaac did not. Because Isaac lived a life in peace. He was at peace. And peaceful people are boring. We don't read stories about people that live their life and everything is going well. When Isaac is blessed abundantly, he's given all these things and his life is good. There's no tension in the story of Isaac, only until we get to the story of Jacob and Esau, and not coincidentally, that's where we pick up that story. Isaac lived a life that was at peace. And there was an article in the Easton's Bible Dictionary. I thought this summation of Isaac's life pretty well said it best. He said his life was so quiet and uneventful that it was spent within the circle of a few miles, so guileless that he let Jacob overreach him rather than disbelieve his assurance, so tender that his mother's death was the poignant sorrow of years, so patient and gentle that the peace with his neighbors was dearer than even such coveted possessions as a well of living water dug by his own men, so grandly obedient that he put his life at his father's disposal, so firm in his reliance on God that his greatest concern through life was to honor the divine promise given to his race. That's what we see in Isaac. He had peace, but he had peace for a reason, because he trusted God. As I mentioned earlier, we see this parallel between David and Solomon over in 2 Samuel 7 as David is being promised. And God tells him, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name. I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father. He shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. And we all know the story of Solomon. From his very birth, it says that God loved Solomon. God gave him everything. Just as we see with Isaac, he gave him riches, he gave him wisdom, he gave him a kingdom, he gave him peace. What happens with Solomon? Solomon falls away. Solomon allows the world to influence him. Solomon allows himself to become complacent. Solomon allows himself to become driven more by the blessings that God has given him than by God himself. But we don't see that with Isaac. We see a man who remained faithful all his life. And I think Isaac shows us in a lot of ways when we think about, well, what does this have to do with me? We see the idea that Isaac shows what a life looks like when God is with you. None of that means that Isaac had everything he needed or everything that he wanted, everything that, the snap of the finger. He never had any problems, never had any bad days, none of that. What we know is that Isaac trusted God and that his life was good. That's our promise. That's what we have in Christ. I was talking to a guy, and most of you probably know him. I'm not going to use his name, but he'll probably tell you the same story and tell you the same thing. He talked about what his life was like before he came to the Lord, he and his wife. And he described it as chaos. It was always drama. It was always something going on. It was always some difficulty, always some struggle that we were having to deal with. But when we turned our lives over to Christ, something happened. We had peace. Our life got calmer. Our life got quieter. You know, and a lot of people in the world, that's really not what they're looking for. I want the drama. We've been people, we've seen people that are like that. That if I'm not in trouble, I'm not really living. And the idea that I want that adrenaline, I want that uncertainty, that's not what God offers. God offers something that is better. He offers a life of security and safety and joy. Isaac shows what life looks like when we are convicted that God has something better waiting for us at some point in our life if we're willing to take it, if we're willing to trust God. That, to me, is an invaluable thing. Particularly last week, I've thought about that. You know, I debated talking about this, but, you know, we've seen a lot of things. 2020 has been just a rough year all the way around. I've heard a lot of comments about rebooting 2020. In this last month particularly, we've seen so much strife, so much anger over a lot of things, and most particularly in this last week, the idea of the man who was killed by a policeman and the reactions that we have seen, and sadly the division that has come as a result of that. We've got people, brothers and sisters in Christ, who are in pain, who are suffering, who are angry, who are frustrated. And sadly, a lot of the pain seems to be coming from people that don't really get it and don't understand why they're so angry and why they can't let it go. Why can't you get over this? You know, so many of our arguments end up becoming very legalistic in terms of, well, is it murder 1? Is it murder 3? Is it whatever it may be? And we get caught up into the idea of making sure that everything is done exactly the way it needs to be done and correcting certain ideas and we forget the bigger picture is that we have brothers and sisters who are in pain. It's very easy for us to forget those things and to forget to remind ourselves over and over again that we are going to have difficulties in life, but at the same time to remind ourselves that the solution of that is not to simply trust the government to get it right, or to trust whatever thing on this earth that we have, but to trust God. To know that ultimately the only way we're ever going to be at peace, the only way we're ever going to see justice, the only way we're ever going to see anything resolved that is good from this world is to wait for it. That God will provide it. And Isaac, as good as his life was still convinced that there was something left, something more. He is called a man of faith. He is called someone who, as we are called to be, believed everything that we talked about, the idea that God was able to bring something life from lifelessness. God was able to bring something that was not from something that, take something that was from something that was not. And we see those examples. Romans 5 tells us that, therefore, since we have been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Through him, we have also obtained access by faith into this grace in which we stand. And we rejoice in hope of the glory of God. Not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance. Endurance produces character, and character produces hope. Hope does not put us to shame because God's love has been poured into our heart through the Holy Spirit, who has been given to us. For while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. You know, that's the challenge for us. Isaac had an easy life in a lot of ways. We may not have it so easy. Some of us do, some of us don't. And it's easy enough for us to say, well, just trust God and everything will work out. But ultimately, that's what we're called to do. And as difficult as that sometimes may be, what does Colossians 3:15 tells us? To let the peace of Christ rule in your heart, to which indeed you were called in one body, and be thankful. Even on days when it's hard. Even on days when it's difficult. That is the example. We see Isaac not only as an example of a man who was righteous, but Isaac as a demonstration of what our lives can be when we trust God. So the lesson is yours this morning. Hopefully it's been useful. Hopefully it's been encouraging. If there's anyone here this morning who has any needs of the saints, if you need to be encouraged, if you're watching this and you need our prayers, you need to talk about God more further, you're finding yourself unable to deal with the uncertainty of this life and you need answers. The Bible has answers. They may not be the ones that you're going to like, but they're answers that you can count on because we see God is faithful. He will do all that he has promised for us. Whatever your need may be, we ask you to let us know as we're led now in our invitation song by Alex.